What an interesting quote to open up this new season. Considering the fact that the person quoted is a fictional character from a short story, which the story involved the King of Yellow, who we know the Yellow King was heavily throughout the season 1 of True Detective, which in my eyes makes this new story a perfect sequel to that incredible season. As it is time for us to discuss and break down Episode 1, Part 1 of Season 4 of True Detective. We're introduced to this mysterious man who's on a hunt for reindeer. As he singles out one of them and is about to shoot, the sun begins to set, and all of a sudden this herd of reindeer seems to be afraid and jumps off the cliff. Now I'm assuming they jumped to their death, almost like something triggered them or something was awakened. Now, they all seem to be doing their normal routine, from washing clothes, working out, reading a book. One of them's even watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and we even see one of the scientists is on live on their phone while making a sandwich. As one of them, named Clark, appears out of nowhere as he's shaking as if something or someone has taken over his body, as he says,
"She's awake."
And out of nowhere, the power goes out. Now, what exactly happened and who is she? We'll be talking about that a little bit later in this breakdown. But I do want to point out before moving on, is that the same coat that Anne had on from the picture that Liz finds a little bit later in this episode? As we cut to December 20th, which is the third day of night, as the delivery of supplies have arrived, the driver can't find anyone to sign off of this drop-off, but he briefly sees a mysterious person running across the hallway, which I believe might be Clark, who I think is the only scientist that might still be alive. You'll notice the glitch in the television, something that happens several times throughout this episode, when it appears that someone is getting closer to figuring out what's actually happening. Now we see this driver drops his keys and all of a sudden he finds a tongue. What an extremely creepy and chilling way to open up this season, but more particularly, I'm loving the hint at the supernatural here. Now, taking a look at these opening credits, we might have some Easter eggs or some clues about what to expect in this season. As we see a polar bear, which is missing an eye on a rocking chair. It looks like Liz is drowning. Is that foreshadowing for the character a little bit later in this season? We see a graveyard, a paper saying protect our water, which I'm assuming is something from Anne, who we know is a protester a little bit later in this episode. We also see a reindeer with red eyes. And of course, we have the heads of the screaming scientists. Did you all notice any other Easter eggs or clues? Let me know in the comments below. As we get our first introduction to Evangeline Navarro, I found the small talk that she's having with this guy to be very interesting, as she notices the shortage of crabs and he tells her that it's been getting worse every year. Now, as we'll talk about later in this breakdown with the death and the murder of Anne, I wonder if that shortage happened shortly after Anne's death. And again, the supernatural of it all, that things start to go bad after her death, and is she the one that's awakened? Now, we see that there was a physical altercation between a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and one of the employees stepped in and knocked out the boyfriend. And in this scene, we see that Navarro's character is really being kind of played up, as it's said a little bit later that she's someone that stands up for others. She's someone that stands up for those that's being taken advantage of or abused. As we learned, this guy did hit his girlfriend, has a history of hitting his girlfriend, and I believe the young lady name was Blair, and Navarro listens to her story and she takes her side. So I think that this scene, as we'll talk about later with Liz in her introduction, this tells us a lot about what we can expect of this character. So I'm very much intrigued by this character, as she seems to have her own demons that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now we see that Navarro gets a phone call, which, by the way, we never find out who called her and what the call was about, and the next time we see her is in the scene with Liz in her office asking about that tongue. I'm going to get more into who she might have been on the phone with here in a second, but speaking of Liz, let's talk about the introduction of Liz, who's one of our main characters played by Jodie Foster, as she arrives to the crime scene of the missing scientist. Now you'll notice the cover song playing in the background is One of Sorrow, which is a nursery rhyme, and this nursery rhyme is a song for children talking about magpies. Now, according to old superstition, the number of magpies seen tells you if you're going to be having good luck or bad luck, which is something that I think we should keep in mind a little bit later as we move forward with this show, because I don't recall seeing any birds or magpies in this episode, but there's definitely an emphasis and focus on animals that we see in this particular episode, so I wouldn't be surprised if we see a magpie a little bit later in this season. As she enters the room, she races to turn off the television that still is playing Ferris Bueller, and the song Twist and Turn by the Beatles is still playing. Now, Liz claimed that she's not a fan of the Beatles, which there might be some truth in that, but I think that the song might have a deeper meaning to something bad that happened to her in the past. Now, Pete fills Liz in, and we'll later find out that Peter is actually the son of Hank, as we learn that this researching location has been running for over 18 years. They research things as far as geology, biology, but more importantly, the impacts of climate change. As we learn what each scientist specializes in, we see that Clark is someone that specializes in microorganisms that are associated with prehistoric materials. Now, did Clark stumble upon something prehistoric that might explain that supernatural possession that was taking over him? As we find out that they lived there all year long, as Peter tells Liz that he believes they're looking for the origins of life. Now, Liz finds a writing on a board that says we are all dead, clearly written after all of them were taken. I really enjoyed this character beat from Liz, as Hank assumes that the sandwich was fresh, but we see how good Liz is at her job, as she quickly is able to put together how long they've been missing based on the mayo on the sandwich, and she also can smell the bad clothes in the washer. Now, I do want to point out about the comment that Liz makes about the mayo, as she says that she learned this because her kid left their lunch in the back seat, as we'll talk about that kid Holden, who's someone that she lost at some point of her life. As they take a look at the tongue on the floor, Liz points out the marks and says that this belongs to a native woman. Now, I want to talk about the behavior of Hank in this scene. Now, there's a quick scene where we see him reading something very suspiciously, but more importantly, when they're in the kitchen, he's texting someone and he doesn't seem to be paying attention. Now, I believe that this could be the wife that we find out that he's going to be marrying a little bit later in this episode, or do we believe that Hank was maybe texting Navarro and tipping her off about the discovery of this tongue? Now, here we're introduced to Rose, who is field dressing a wolf, and as she's listening to the radio playing, you'll notice that there's a glitch in the radio very similar to the glitch on the television, as that wolf who's dead is slightly moving. She turns around to find who we later find out is her dead son Travis, who's trying to communicate with her from the dead. Again, another sign of the supernatural, which I'm absolutely loving so far in this show. Now, here in this scene, we get our first encounter between our two main leads, Liz and Navarro, and immediately you can tell that there's a level of respect that they have for one another, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they like each other, as Navarro questions if the recently found tongue belonged to Anne, who we find out was murdered 6 years ago. In this case, seamlessly consumed her because she couldn't let it go. Now, Navarro knows that this tongue belongs to a native woman, but Liz kind of jokes with her about this unreleased information because she speaks to animals and spirits in her dreams. Now, I think that animals, but also dreams, will play a big part into this season. But again, the question I have is, how did Navarro know about this information? Again, I'm under the belief that Hank was giving her this information because he knows how important this case is to her. Now, Liz requests that Peter finds Anne's case so she can kind of look into it a little bit more, but she's interrupted by a phone call because Leah got caught recording sexual activities with her girlfriend. Now, as we're introduced to Leah, who is arguing with Liz in a car, they almost get into a car accident, and as Liz checks on the driver, as she's approaching to the car, she slightly steps on ice, and we get this very quick cut scene of someone walking in daylight and immediately cuts back to the accident. Now, I'm to assume that Liz connected this accident to something that happened to her or something that she experienced, which I think might explain Holden, who we know is her son, who appears to be dead. Now, we learn that the person that Liz got into this accident with goes by the name of Stacy, who appears to be the town drunk. Now, going back to Navarro, we get a little bit more information regarding Anne as we meet her brother by the name of Ryan. As Navarro is taking this discovery of the tongue as a possible connection to Anne, it might be connected to the missing scientist. We find out that Anne was a protester and an activist, and she wanted to make a change, and this pissed off a lot of people in the town, especially the people that worked in the mines. Now, Ryan tells Navarro that he got into a lot of arguments with his sister about her protesting, and that if the mines were to ever get shut down, there goes the town. So you can start to put the pieces together in regarding that Anne was someone who was concerned about climate change. And as Peter told us a little bit earlier in this episode, those missing scientists also studied a lot of different things, but one of the things they studied was climate change. So you can make the connections that maybe Anne was in a relationship or was friendly with one of those scientists, as we'll talk about a little bit later in this breakdown. Now, we see Ryan asking her if she believed in God, and we see her response is yes. Now, as she's explaining her yes, we see this scene where she cuts back to her last tour, and one of her, who I assume was a close friend of hers, their face was half missing, but they were able to whisper something to her, which we don't find out what she said, but I'm assuming we'll learn a little bit later in some point of the season of what actually was said to her at this moment. Now, sticking on Navarro, we meet her sister by the name of Jules. Now, there seems to be some type of mystery or some type of situation going on with Jules because it is important to her that she doesn't turn out like their mother. Now, there is talk about not taking her to a hospital. Now, I might be wrong, but going back to Liz mentioning to Navarro about spirit animals and dreams, I wonder if Jules is having like mental breakdowns or paranoia, or more importantly, like these very vivid dreams. And maybe their mother had similar type of situations that went on with her. And maybe the people of the town called her crazy for having these dreams and talking about animals. And again, maybe Jules is having the same type of dreams, and maybe she's even hearing whoever this woman is that has all of a sudden been reawakened. Now, cutting back to Liz in her office talking to Peter, who's giving her information about where the funding of this research center came from, as he mentions that one of them was a non-governmental organization. But as he's about to say who else funded this company, we see Stacy screaming in the background, disturbing everyone. But I want to know who else was funding this particular building, which I think is a mystery we should keep an eye on moving forward. Now, as they go to check on Stacy, I found it interesting that we see Liz is taking like these digs at Hank, not only in this scene, but earlier when they were in that kitchen at the research facility. She talks about how he is a dad that didn't make sandwiches, but also that him and Stacy have been hooking up in the past, as he mentions that he has a girlfriend that he's going to turn to his wife in a couple days. But I'm very interested in this relationship between Liz and Hank. Did they have a secret romance or maybe a public romance that went wrong? Because again, you can tell that there's some type of tension between these two characters. Now, cutting to a very important scene in my eyes as we head to Peter's house, and this is where we meet his son's mother by the name of Kayla, but also we meet his son by the name of Darwin. Now, Darwin is drawing a woman who seems to have X's on her eyes or blood, but also has blood running down her hands as well, as we see Peter's girlfriend says that these are stories maybe that her mother would tell their son Darwin as he was being babysitted by her. Now, my question is this the same woman that Clark was talking about being awake? As Kayla says that this is some type of local legend, I'm very curious to learn more about this legend and if this supernatural entity has anything to do with what's going on in this episode. Now, we see the scene between Kayla and Peter. They're sharing a little bit of an intimate moment together, but that's interrupted because Liz is calling Peter to go to his father's house to get Anne's case files, as we see that taking place in the next scene. Now, I do want to point out in this scene between the father and son, one, do you all think that Hank knew that Peter took the case file, but he just didn't want to impress him about it? But then also, when Peter lies to say that he went over there to get a picture to show his son when he was younger, we notice there's a woman in that picture. Now, I'm assuming that that is Hank's ex-wife, but also Peter's mom. But my question is, where is she? Did they have a divorce? Did their relationship not work out? Was there infidelity involved? But also, is she even alive? As we quickly cut back to Rose, we see that she's following Travis into the darkness of the snowy night. Now, back at Liz's house, Peter presses her about giving him information about the connections that Liz has between the scientists and Anne. Now, this is where we get the tragic backstory of what actually happened to Annie K, as she was stabbed 32 times with an unidentified weapon that was never found, and that it made star-shaped wounds, and that her tongue was taken out and that was never recovered. And again, this is where we find out that she was a protester that drove the workers and minor folks mad, and she made a lot of enemies. As we got that backstory involving Anne, we also found out what happened to Navarro. Now, she got into several fights with the locals, with the people that worked in the mines, but she also seemed to get into some type of mix-up with a character by the name of Kate, who sounds like someone you don't want to bother. Now, I don't know if Kate is maybe the mayor of the town or maybe an owner of the mines, but this behavior or obsession forced Hank to take Navarro off the case. Now, we also find out that Liz isn't a local, but she came into town and she actually worked very closely with Navarro at one point, as Liz was convinced that the town killed her and that the killer would never be found. Now, back with Navarro, we meet her buddy by the name of Havoc, who is someone she sleeps with on her own terms. Going back to Liz, as we have a conversation between her and Leah, who brings up people drinking drunk and how they never talk about that day. Now, they don't go into details, but Leah tells her that she doesn't have to be her mom. So now I'm thinking that maybe Liz was maybe the wife of Leah's father, and they had a kid together, and that kid and also their father died in a car accident involving someone who was drunk. Or maybe Leah's dad was the one that drunk and maybe killed Liz's kid in a car accident, and she kind of took it upon herself to become the mother of Leah. As Leah says that her dad would understand why she wouldn't want to continue to take care of her. So let me know what you all think is this relationship between the drunk driver, Liz, Leah, and her father in the comments below. As we see Navarro briefly crosses paths with the guy that she met at the beginning of this episode and overhears him talking about what he's going to do to Blair the next time he sees her again, as Navarro pours beer into his truck, I'm wondering if something bad is going to happen to his truck. Is he going to get into a car accident and she's going to have some type of guilty conscience? Now, back with Liz, we find out that her son's name was Holden. Now, as she was sleeping at night, she hears Holden calling out her name, and we see a small hand touching her shoulder. Again, I believe that dreams will play a big role in the show, but also we even hear Holden say, "She's awake." Now, do you all believe that Liz believes in this local legend that seems to be mentioned throughout this episode? As this clearly would wake someone up, she sits up and sees a polar bear with a missing eye on the floor. Now, I couldn't distinguish if she was aware that this polar bear was on the floor and that polar bear belonged to Holden and she keeps it close to her late at night, or did that polar bear just mysteriously appear in the middle of the night? Now, as we wrap up the episode, we see Navarro calling who I believe is Anne's mom to kind of reopen this case and make some connections between Anne and those scientists. And again, all of a sudden, we hear that glitch from the TV, from Rose's radio, and now we have it in this scene as Navarro stops in the middle of the road because she sees a polar bear with a missing eye, and we hear, "Ma'am, hello?" She's away. Again, now, is that polar bear actually there? Does this polar bear have any connections to Liz about that same polar bear that she was holding in her hands that was missing an eye, but also the same polar bear in the opening credits? As Liz is now up in the middle of the night, or maybe it's the morning because we don't know, because it's always night during this time of the year, she reopens Anne's case files and compares them to the missing scientists as she discovers a major clue. Now, it appears that Anne might have had a relationship with one of the scientists, and that scientist was Clark, who we met at the beginning of this episode, who seemed to be under that possession, who was wearing the same jacket in this photo. And also, I want to point out, she sees that same polar bear in one of the photos as well. We end with our final moments here with Rose watching Travis performing this dance routine as he points her in the direction of where the scientists are. We see that Liz goes back to look for that jacket as she runs into Navarro, who's looking for something that she can connect to Anne, and Liz tells her about her discovery of this jacket, but they have no luck finding it because Clark actually had the jacket on. Now, Navarro confronts Liz about why she can't let this case go. After being the first one on the scene and finding Anne's body, she saw the hate displayed on the body and the abuse after killing this person, and also the taking of the tongue was a sign of shutting her up. So this is so important because this just gives us more context of what is driving Navarro to finding out what happened to her, because this seemed to be a passion of hate. As Liz gets the call about Rose's discovery, you'll notice the lights are flickering yet again, another sign of when the characters are finding out something important to this case, some type of supernatural entity seems to be around. As our final shot shows Liz and Navarro on the crime scene, finding at least 3 of who I assume are the bodies of the now dead scientists. Now, I found it very interesting that Rose and Navarro had a brief conversation about Travis being dead, but when Liz walked by her, they said nothing to each other. So now I'm starting to think, could Travis be the one that was involved in the death of either Leah's father or maybe even Liz's son? Overall, what a creepy and eerie episode to open up this new season, what I hope to be a great season of True Detective. I really bought into these characters and their motives and their relationship, and more importantly, as a horror fan, I love the sense of horror and the supernatural that's surrounding this mystery so far. Which, speaking of that mystery, I'm so intrigued to figuring out what happened to number 1, not only the scientists, but the backstory of who killed Anne. Now, for my movie fans out there, I can't help but to make the connection between what's going on with these scientists and Anne in the amazing film by the name of Wind River. Now, without spoiling the movie for those that haven't seen it, which I highly recommend you all watch that incredible movie, I'm starting to think, what if Clark had a relationship with Anne and some of those miners found out about that relationship and actually killed her in front of Clark and threatened to kill him if he told anyone what happened? Or maybe the scientist did something to her and Clark was forced to keep his mouth closed, or maybe Clark killed Anne himself. But the other question at the top of my mind is, what happened to Liz's son? What happened to Leah's dad? What does Rose and her dead Travis have to do with any of this in the meaning of the connections of dreams and animals, the reindeer, the birds, the polar bear, but more importantly, who's the woman that's now awake? Is it the town's legend mentioned throughout this episode and we saw potentially in Darwin's drawing? And does she have anything to do with the glitches and the mysterious things going on throughout this episode? So that's going to be the end of this breakdown and review of episode 1, part 1 of season 4 of True Detective. Join me at the same time, at the same place here on my channel next week for episode 2. Make sure that you leave your thoughts on this episode in the comments, but also please share your thoughts, your theories, and your ideas of where you hope to see things head in this season in the comments below. You all are awesome, stay safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.